It was not, in fact, a combat action. 100 planes were destroyed in accidents for every one lost to enemy action. However, the most audacious endeavor of World War II was probably the attempt to completely resupply Allied forces in China by air. There were more challenges than any earlier attempt, including the amphibious landings on beaches from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and Casablanca to Normandy. These challenges had to be surmounted merely to keep China in the war and stop the Japanese from occupying all of Asia. Rugged mountains, rushing rivers, boiling jungles, and harsh weather, the very characteristics that determine how areas are populated, trade routes are established, and conflicts are waged, were barriers that date back to the beginning of human history. These are the challenges that ultimately determine the evolution of nations and contemporary armed forces. These challenges could never have been overcome before 1942. The cost of overcoming them was high, even at that time. Though evolving events in the spring and summer of 1942 made it clear that aircraft resupply was the only viable way to deliver supplies to a nation that at that point had been totally shut off from the sea, the exact decision to try to resupply China by air is lost to history. Japanese forces had taken control of the southern two-thirds of Burma and the port cities of China by the middle of 1942. Rangoon had fallen into Japanese hands after the Burma Road was blocked, while Japanese troops conquered French Indochina through a proxy operation from the Germans, who now controlled France. Thailand, which was located to the south, was an ally of Japan. The only way to get supplies into the vast interior of China, which was still under Allied control, was by air because there were no appropriate roads and all of China's seaports were under Japanese control. The American-educated wife of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, helped China, the first nation to be attacked by the Japanese, to rely on the United States as a useful friend. Madame Chiang persuaded President Franklin D. Roosevelt to give her nation military weapons and other forms of assistance by using her American contacts. T.V., her brother. Chinese Americans were reminded of their homeland and its numerous problems by Soong, the leader of the China lobby in the U.S. China had been the focus of American missionary endeavors for almost a century, and the evangelical Christian movement in the United States provided the Soongs with a ready audience for their message. Due to its location in regard to Japan, China rapidly assumed a strategic importance when war finally reached the United States on December 7, 1941. At first, Allied planners viewed China as a way to advance the fight to the Japanese homeland, despite the fact that events forced the large Asian nation to the back burner. From air bases in China, American heavy bombers, the consolidated B-24 Liberators, and the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses could launch a strategic bombing campaign against Japan. In 1942's spring, the U.S., in order to defend China and launch an aerial attack on Japan, the War Department approved the creation of the 10th Air Force. In order to establish an air force consisting of two groups of pursuit planes, a group of heavy bombers, and a group of medium bombers, along with a troop carrier group to facilitate air transportation, Major General Louis Brereton was moved from Australia to India. This plan actually included the infamous Doolittle strike on Japan, in which 18 North American B-25s authorized for deployment in China were diverted by presidential order to launch an aircraft carrier strike on Japan. According to the War Department's plan, they would leave an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, fly over Japan, and then continue on to China. The B-25s were supposed to serve as the core of a medium bomber force in China once they arrived. American transports were first sent to India for flights to China because of the Doolittle Force's imminent arrival, 10 Pan-American Airways. Douglas DC-3 transports, contracted to the Army Ferry Command, were transferred from Africa, where they had been assisting British soldiers, to India before to the raid. In order to service the B-25s once they got to China, they were supposed to pre-position oil and fuel at Chinese airfields. It turned out that none of the B-25s made it safely. Doolittle chose to launch the bombers near the edge of their range in order to even hit Japan when the task group was found. None of them had a good chance of surviving in China. Although the attack was a propaganda success for the Roosevelt administration, Allied intentions to launch an air campaign against Japan from China in 1942 were were thwarted by the loss of the B-25s and the subsequent seizure of the planned bomber base location. Colonel Caleb V. Haynes was traveling to India by way of the overland route over Africa and Central Asia with a combined flight of Boeing B-17s and Douglas C-47 transports, while the Doolittle Raiders were traveling to China on the aircraft carrier Hornet. Project Aquila, the name given to Haynes's unit, was intended to act as the core of a heavy bomber force in China. These aircraft were to be transferred from Australia to a bombardment group. The 7th Bombardment Group's tiny number of B-17s and LB-30 and B-24 Liberators had been significantly reduced after fighting in Java and the Philippines. The Halpro Group ultimately redirected to the Middle East, where it would later be joined by the Aquila B-17s. Another force of B-24s, led by Colonel Harry Halverson, was also scheduled to depart for China, but its departure from the United States was postponed. When Haynes and his troops arrived, they found that the Japanese had launched an offensive in response for the Doolittle raid, which had worsened the military situation in China. Japanese forces were moving into Burma, and the planned bomber bases had been overrun. Haynes and some of his men were sent to the C-47s to transport supplies into Burma, giving up their B-17s. They removed Allied forces from the nation as the military situation worsened. Regretfully, the Japanese achieved success in eastern China and Burma, leaving the Allies utterly stranded. The only way to send supplies was via India, even though Chinese soldiers controlled the country's enormous interior. The rough terrain of eastern India and central Burma made land delivery highly challenging even in the absence of enemy activity. But when Japanese forces severed the Burma Road, even that possibility was ruled out. The only way to get supplies to China after the land routes were shut was by air. By the spring of 1942, it was clear that the 10th Air Force, which the War Department had established to oversee air operations in the China-Burma-India theater, was to play a significant role in bringing supplies to China. Although China's significance to the strategic plan diminished with the loss of the intended bomber sites, one factor made it possible for the Allies to still value the nation. Deep in the Chinese interior, Chennault's Flying Tigers developed into an air force. Prior to the conflict, retired U.S. To aid China, Army Captain Claire Chennault had assembled an all-volunteer air force with former American service members as its members. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the American Volunteer Group went into action and made it clear to the world that Japanese aviation units were not unbeatable. The Flying Tigers, Chennault's small fighter unit, would grow into an air force that operated deep within the Chinese interior. It would encircle Japanese aviation units in Southeast Asia, preventing some of them from relocating to other theaters. As a brigadier general, Chennault was called back to active duty and assigned to lead the 10th Air Force's subordinate China Air Task Force, CATF. For what the CATF would require to be a functional combat force, airlift would be the only option. The War Department approved the establishment of a special transport unit to ferry supplies from India to China, after it became clear that air replenishment of China would be a significant Allied mission in the CBI. Project Amiska, a special effort comprising a ferry force composed of 100 recalled Army reservists, primarily active airline pilots, was established in March 1942. The reservist pilots joined enlisted radio operators and crew chiefs at the Ferry Command facility at Morrison Field, Florida. Ferry Command was established in 1941 with the sole operational purpose of supplying crews temporarily assigned by the Air Combat Command to transport American-built aircraft delivered to the Allies under Lend-Lease. Nonetheless, the command was given permission to hire planes and staff from the airlines to provide a ferry of supplies to British forces in North Africa right before the conflict. Therefore, it was tasked with shipping supplies to China. The War Department's decision that the India-China ferry should fall under the purview of the 10th Air Force further complicated matters. Although the original plan called for General Joseph Stilwell, the senior Allied officer in China, to have direct control over Amiska, 10th Air Force Commander Brig, General Clayton Bissell naturally felt that if he was going to be in charge of the air ferry, then he should have command of all the assets involved. Brig. General Robert Olds, the commander of Amiska and a former employee of Ferry Command, resisted the move, but, Bissell prevailed. Amiska joined the 10th Air Force upon its arrival in India as the first ferrying group. In Asia, there existed a third air transportation organization that might have provided even greater opportunities for success than the first ferrying group. Pan American Airways, which was founded in China in the 1930s, owned China National Aviation Corporation, CNAC. Many of the pilots had previously flown for the U.S. military, and some had joined the airline after quitting Chennault's AVG. They adapted swiftly to the challenging conditions encountered on the trips to China. For the majority of 1942, CNAC would be the China ferry's primary element. The Assam-Burma China ferry route and a trans-India route from Karachi to the Assam Valley, from which supplies headed for China would depart, were surveyed by Brigadier General Earl Naden. In order to transfer supplies to river barges and then to trucks for the rest of the journey to Chungking and Kunming, the most direct and effective approach was to cross Burma to the airstrip at Myat Kina on the Burma-China border. However, Japanese forces in Burma strategically targeted Myat Kina, seizing the airstrip on May 8th and casting doubt on the effectiveness of the resupply attempt to China. Japanese fighters posed a threat to Burmese airspace from Myat Kina, and their bombers were easily accessible from the Indian sites from where the airlift was to be launched. The 10th Air Force set the airfield at Myat Kina as its main goal in order to lessen the threat to India and the Japanese efforts against the airlines to China. President Roosevelt took a personal interest in the delivery of supplies to China, setting monthly tonnage targets as a result. This garnered political attention at the highest level of the U.S. administration. The objectives might have been achieved if the CBI's sole military consideration had been to fly supplies into China. The 10th Air Force had to prioritize the employment of its forces, with the defense of India taking precedence, due to the unfortunate westward movement of Japanese soldiers. In the theater and in New Guinea in the Southwest Pacific, where Allied forces encountered comparable challenges, air mobility was proving to be a significant aid to ground operations. Transports from the first ferrying group were frequently diverted to missions supporting war operations due to military considerations for the protection of India. The China ferry had one fewer aircraft available each time a transport was diverted to another mission. The 10th Air Force was accused of having a defeatist attitude and lacking a singleness of purpose in Sinclair's damning report. Due in large part to the interests of the American firm supplying military materials to the Chinese, there was a high level of political interest in the delivery of supplies to China. In order to facilitate the delivery of Lend-Lease supplies between the Chinese government and the American manufacturers, Whiting Willower, a lawyer with political ties from New York, established China Defense Supplies, Inc. as their representative firm. Willower played a key role in the AVG's establishment as well. Executives whose businesses stood to profit millions from the supply effort were indifferent to the military issues facing the area, and payment for items was dependent on their arrival to Chinese territory. In the summer of 1942, Frank D. Sinclair, a representative of China Defense Supplies, Inc., who held the position of aviation technical advisor within the organization, traveled to India to see the airlift. In a damning report, Sinclair, who had airline ties and an aviation background, accused the 10th Air Force of missing singleness of purpose and having a defeatist attitude with reference to the China ferry. Given the gravity of the military situation in eastern India in 1942, which Sinclair either ignored or did not understand, his claims seem absurd in light of that. The White House did, however, take notice of the story. Additionally, a duplicate was sent to the fledgling Air Transport Command headquarters. In fact, despite a number of issues, chief among them the loss of Myat Kina, the attempt to get supplies to China was moving forward. Transports had to fly all the way to Kunming to deliver their loads because the central Burmese airfield was no longer open for transshipment. This decreased the transport's efficiency and the quantity of supplies they could deliver. In addition, the risk of being intercepted compelled the unarmed transports to take a further detour, flying north into the eastern Himalayas before going east to their destinations in China. The foothills north of the Assam Valley were taller than the American Rockies, despite the high Himalayas being far to the west. High mountain elevations and humid air masses heading north from the Bay of Bengal combined to create some of the worst weather on Earth, including severe mountain turbulence that could tear an airplane apart, violent thunderstorms with torrential rain, and strong winds that made navigation challenging. Rain converted to snow and ice at higher altitudes, which may strain an airplane's wings and push it against the mountaintops. Stilwell was against the idea of giving the China National Aviation Corporation full control over the transportation of supplies to China. In his opinion, it would be a mistake for American military people to be governed by a company whose civilian employees received far greater salaries. Instead, Stilwell suggested that the 10th Air Force be given the contract for the CNAC, a proposal that was approved by the Chinese government, who owned the airline, as well as the War Department. The transportation of supplies from Dinjan to China was the sole responsibility of the CNAC transport. Even if the airlift started later than the White House had hoped, it was nonetheless a start. In particular, the CNAC transporters quickly developed a productive routine. However, the transfer of some of its aircraft, one squadron was diverted to the Middle East in June, caused numerous issues for the first ferrying group mission. By mid-1942, only roughly two-thirds of the group's allocated aircraft had arrived in India. While some were redirected to support military activities in Africa and the Middle East, many were involved in accidents during the transfer. Accidents afflicted the transport force when they started operations. The China ferry was eventually impacted by events that occurred in the spring of 1942, but not until the end of the year. In a letter to President Roosevelt, Civil Aeronautics Board Director Lawrence Pogue expressed his worry that the nation's airlines were losing out on future military contracts due to the random selection process. The establishment of a government-run, quasi-military airline that would operate independently of the Departments of War and the Navy and report directly to the President was Pogue's answer. Another option was for the War Department to establish its own Air Transportation Command to manage airline contracts, at the very least. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, took matters into his own hands before a board of military commanders formed to study the issue provided a solution. General Order No. 8, which Arnold issued on June 20th, established an Army Air Transportation Organization to handle all air transportation requirements outside of those directly associated with fighting. The order granted the new organization the designation of Air Transport, which had previously been assigned to the squadrons and groups established to assist combat operations. The reorganization also moved the responsibility for awarding military contracts to the airlines from the Air Service Command to the new Air Transport Command, renaming the prior air transport units as troop carriers. The Air Transport Command was given two tasks: transporting military aircraft, including those that were sent to other countries via Lend-Lease, from manufacturing to combat units, and carrying military personnel and supplies. The Ferrying Division and the Air Transportation Division were its two divisions as a result. The Army relied significantly on the aviation industry to supply a number of essential professionals who were directly commissioned as field-grade officers to staff the new command. As the new ATC's Chief of Staff, American Airlines President Cyrus R. Smith was initially given the rank of colonel and tasked with overseeing and managing the Air Transport Division. For contract pilots and air crews, as well as for former airline employees to fill military posts, both divisions relied significantly on the national airline business. Additionally, service pilots, or personnel with prior civilian aviation expertise who were drafted into the military without first completing military pilot school, were employed by the Air Transport Command. There were also a significant number of female pilots in ATC's Ferrying Division. These women had prior civilian flying experience and were hired in the same way as male civilian contract pilots, with the exception that their operations were limited to North America. When ATC Chief of Staff C.R. Smith came into possession of a copy of the Sinclair letter, he spotted and grabbed an opportunity for both his new command and the airline he ran in civilian life. He clarified Sinclair's grievances and argued that the CBI should create a separate command dedicated to shipping supplies to China. Smith suggested that the airlift of supplies to China be taken over by the Air Transport Command. He argued that the Air Transport Command would naturally be able to provide a better product than the Army's Combat Command since it was composed of air transportation professionals. Smith said the only things needed would be the air bases from which the ATC transports would operate and the theater unit's assistance in the form of base facilities. The rest would be done by ATC. Smith presented a compelling argument, and General Stilwell agreed to his suggestion. On December 1, 1942, the airlift to China was to be taken over by the ATC. Smith's plan, regrettably, was largely based on wishful thinking, and his order would not only fail, it would fail severely. Because of the rarefied air, crews flying the Hump were constantly under danger of enemy attack and experienced decreased aircraft performance. The Sant Sung Range, a lengthy ridge that rose to a height of 15,000 feet in some areas, and was located between the Mekong and Salween River valleys on the Burma-China border, was the Hump that finally gave the airlift its name. Thankfully, northern Burma was occupied by Allied forces, primarily Chinese and native Gurkhas, which allowed 10th Air Force fighters tasked with guarding the airlift route to establish advance posts. In order to limit Japanese fighter capabilities and enable more direct delivery from the transport bases in India's Assam Valley to the destination airfields at Kunming and Chungking, Allied aircraft and bombers focused on Japanese airfields in central Burma. Despite the occasional threat of enemy airstrikes, the crews operating the Hump were always in danger, not least because their aircraft performed worse in the rarefied air at the airfields. Several thousand feet above sea level was where many of these were situated. Air Transport Command saw at least 134 significant incidents on the Hump route in the 6 months of 1943, many of which happened during takeoff and landing. Tonnage numbers actually decreased in the initial months following the handover, despite Smith's promises that ATC would expand airlift capacity across the Hump. Despite an increase in the airlift force's numbers and perceived capabilities, the drop occurred. ATC started planning to replace the Douglas C-47s that the 1st Ferrying Group was flying with modern aircraft when it took over the Hump mission. A group of consolidated C-87 four-engine cargo planes landed in India at the beginning of 1943. The flight crews were contracted from American Airlines, which is owned by C.R. Smith. With its larger payload, the C-87, the transport variant of the B-24 Liberator bomber, was expected to significantly boost tonnage capabilities. It did not, however, meet the initial expectations. The Curtiss C-46 Commando, a sizable twin-engine aircraft with a significantly greater payload capacity than the DC-3 and C-47, was the other new type allocated to the Hump operation. However, the C-46 was a mechanic's nightmare due to its poor design, especially the fuel system, which involved miles and miles of steel and aluminum tubing. Fortunately, design changes made the C-46 a suitable transport, though it never fulfilled expectations. It would take the India-China wing an additional 6 months to reach the 4,000 tons per month target it had set for February 1943, despite ATC's pledge to boost the airlift tonnage. The War Department and White House, however, were guaranteeing tonnage levels twice as high as those being carried. For instance, 1,000 tons was the target for September 1943, when the total tonnage eventually surpassed 4,000 tons. Major General Harold George, the head of Air Transport Command, blamed the 10th Air Force, saying the India-China wing was a relic of the 1st Ferrying Group that had been moved to Theater Command in spite of the Ferry Command leadership's objections. Such an argument is untenable. As a matter of fact, other units engaged in airlifting supplies to China were continuously improving. Even though ATC squadrons had C-87s and C-46s, which could carry much higher payloads than the CNAC DC-3s, by September 1943, the CNAC was hauling an average of 49 tons per airplane per month, while ATC units were only carrying 23. In addition, the 1st and 2nd Troop Carrier squadrons were far more effective than ATC as soon as they started flying in India in the spring of 1943. As restitution for the loss of the 1st Ferrying Group, the 10th Air Force was promised 2 Troop Carrier squadrons, many of whose crews had just returned from training in the United States. The India-China wing's issues were clearly internal. In the spring of 1943, Eddie Rickenbacker, the president of Eastern Airlines and a World War I hero, visited the CBI. Having worked in aviation for many years, Rickenbacker understood that the command structure was the true source of the airlift's issues. While anticipating priority support from a theater command that was up to its ears in combat operations, the Air Transport Command was trying to run an autonomous command inside a conflict zone. In addition, Rickenbacker pointed out that there were insufficient airdromes to manage the airlift operation, and that there were also a dearth of engineers, maintenance workers, weather forecasters, and communications specialists. Rickenbacker believed that giving the 10th Air Force back control of the airlift mission was the only sensible course of action. The military establishment in Washington, particularly the Air Transport Command leadership, did not share Rickenbacker's opinions. ATC was still in charge of the airlift. The issues persisted. Even though the ATC units in India were functioning in circumstances that were neither worse nor worse than those faced by the combat squadrons, low morale was a significant issue. The heat and humidity of India were a shock to Americans used to the temperate climate of the United States. In addition to making life miserable, they caused heavy rains that flooded the bases with hot muck. The presence of insects, rodents of all kinds, and poisonous snakes made matters worse. The belief that battling the Japanese and Germans was more vital than transporting cargo to China was another aspect specific to ATC staff that is rarely covered in airlift histories. The Amiska pilots were American, but they were also recruited from the U.S. airline industry, trained combat pilots and Army reservists. They were aware that additional reservists had been deployed to the American bomber squadrons, frequently in command roles as squadron and flight commanders. But here they were, in a backwater area of the Earth, hauling cargo in unarmed vehicles. Another problem was the absence of youth's enthusiasm. In 1942 and 1943, the young soldiers assigned to the combat squadrons were typically much younger than the ATC pilots. A young man's adventure is frequently an older man's ordeal. It should be noted that when more and more Army pilots became available for transport duties, the airlift's efficiency started to increase. The ATC crews were mocked by combat crews, who called the ATC acronym allergic to combat. In an effort to boost the spirits of the airmen deployed to the Hump assignment, the Air Transport Command launched a number of actions. Poor letter delivery was a major grievance. Thus, the cargo system gave mail a higher priority. Although Hump flyers were more at risk from bad weather and unfavorable terrain than from an armed adversary, General George persuaded the Army Air Forces to approve the granting of combat honors, especially the Air Medal and Distinguished Flying Cross, to them. For the India-China wing, he also received a citation. Several prominent members of the media were invited by ATC headquarters to watch command activities, such as the Hump airlift. Time, Life, and the Saturday Evening Post published photographs and essays created by men like Ivan Dmitri. In addition to drawing attention to the role of the ATC airmen, the publicity also caused the combat crews, particularly troop carrier personnel, to mock the ATC acronym, calling it allergic to combat, or, in the case of the civilian contract crews, Association of Terrified Civilians. The animosity toward ATC also extended to the command levels in the combat units, as theater command personnel began to suspect that the ATC leadership in Washington was trying to establish an empire at their expense. Tonnage levels were eventually able to start rising in mid-1943 when the Army more than fivefold expanded the strength and capabilities of the ATC's India-China wing. To accommodate the significantly expanded airlift equipment, more air bases were put into service in the interior of China and the Assam Valley of India. The India-China wing became the India-China Division, while all other ATC wings were promoted to division rank. Colonel Thomas O. Hardin assumed command of the Hump mission in September after transferring to the India-China Division. In his civilian life, Hardin was an airline executive and was known for being a demanding driver. Additionally, he was a pragmatic leader who understood that official regulations frequently hindered the accomplishment of missions. Implementing 24-hour operations on the Hump route was one of Hardin's initiatives, which significantly increased the daily flight volume. Tonnage capabilities over the Hump were instantly increased by the extra flights. Over 12,000 tons were transported into India by Hump personnel in December. High terrain and unfavorable weather conditions raised the risk of accidents during night operations. The leadership of ATC recognized that a sufficient supply of aircraft and engine parts was a critical component of the airlift's effectiveness. Special weekly flights to India were approved by General George from the Air Service Command Supply Depot, located in Fairfield, Ohio. The mission, known as Fireball, was passed to the Ferrying Division in November, after being started in September by 4 C-87s from the 26th Transport Group. Crew stage bases were positioned along the route to keep the aircraft in motion. There were more operational aircraft available as a result of the quick supplies of aviation parts. ATC transports were very rarely attacked by enemy aircraft, despite the fact that the possibility of enemy interception existed. On October 13, 1943, Japanese fighters operating from forward areas in central Burma attacked Allied aircraft over northern Burma, marking the beginning of the hardest time for the ATC and other crews flying the Hump. That day, a Sienak DC-3 and 2 transports, a C-46 and a C-87, were shot down. 2 C-47s from the 10th Air Force and a B-24 were damaged. When the Japanese attacked many armed B-24s involved in transport operations, they were caught off guard and suffered multiple casualties as a result of their error. 3 more ATC shipments were reported missing over the course of the following 2 weeks, and 2 more were shot down. In December, 2 more trucks were shot down. During the airlift to China, these were the only combat losses suffered by ATC. According to statistics, during the Hump airlift, 7 transports and 13 crew members were lost to enemy action. Although there were relatively few casualties due to enemy action, the number of Hump aircraft and crews lost to accidents was astounding. The route from Assam to Kunming was littered with so many wrecks that some Hump crews started calling it the Aluminum Trail. However, most of the accidents happened at the airfields themselves, where the transports were on the very edge of their operational performance envelope due to the combination of higher elevations and hot temperatures. Among the 4-engine C-87s, the accident rate was very high, probably because the runways were too short for the altitudes involved. Presumably without considering the phenomenon known as density altitude, the Army had set 6,000 feet as the required runway length for a laden C-87. High temperatures cause density altitude, the altitude that truly affects an airplane's performance, to be much higher than the actual elevation, which results in a considerable increase in takeoff distance. The loss of an engine shortly after takeoff on a hot day in high terrain was a sign of oncoming disaster because climb performance is also significantly impacted. Approximately 600 transports and 1,000 airmen are said to have died in mishaps during the Hump airlift. Additional C-46s devoted to the Matterhorn, a special unit outfitted with long-range Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers to launch aerial operations against Japan, arrived in the spring of 1944, significantly expanding the capabilities of the ATC Hump airlift force. As an independent unit, the 20th Air Force deployed to China to deliver fuel from India to the advanced bases in China, from whence the superfortresses would embark on missions against Japan. A number of B-29s from the XX Bomber Command were transformed into tankers. In addition, the Matterhorn force had its own transport squadrons, which were outfitted with C-87s and the C-19 tanker, a new transport variant of the Liberator that went into service in August. A system of fuel-filled tanks was added to the C-109, whereas the C-87 was essentially a B-24 that had been modified to remove its bomber capabilities and add a cargo floor. The purpose of the C-87 and C-109 was to allow ground crews to empty their tanks of excess gasoline at the Chinese sites. The main commodity transported over the Hump, particularly in 1944 and 1945, was aviation gas. The India-China division was able to transport a lot more tonnage over the Hump thanks to the support of the Matterhorn force. The transfer of XX Bomber Command's C-87s and C-109s to the Air Transport Command was a bonus for the division. The transports used to support the B-29s were included in the Hump airlift, when the War Department chose to remove them from China in early 1945. ATC was able to start surpassing its monthly tonnage targets in large part because of the growth in airlift capability. Brig. General Thomas O. Hardin was succeeded as commander of the India-China Division in August 1944 by Brig. General William H. Tunner. An ATC veteran, Tunner began his career in air transport when he served as the Ferry Command's personnel officer before to the war. Tunner was assigned to command the ferrying division at the activation of the ATC. Tunner established a reputation for safety and organization as one of the Army Air Force's first production-oriented leaders. Under Tunner's leadership, the India-China Division set previously unheard-of records, which the general was keen to claim. The current Air Mobility Command views Tunner as the father of military airlift, despite the fact that many historians attribute this to him turning around the airlift. The ATC effort had fallen more than 4,000 tons short of its April allotment, which resulted in the assignment of additional aircraft and crews and a great deal of animosity toward the ATC. Merrill's Marauders' seizure of the Mayat Kina airstrip in May 1944 was one of several events that contributed to the surge in tonnage being flown to China. The Hump airlift benefited from the airfield seizure in two ways, even though the town itself was under Japanese control until August. In addition to providing the ATC with a delivery point from which supplies bound for China could be further carried by vehicle and barge, it denied the Japanese an advanced base for its fighters. ATC personnel headed for China were able to follow a more southerly route over lower and less difficult terrain, since the fear of enemy interception was reduced. The 4-engine Douglas C-54 Skymaster was added to the airlift, since flights into China now had to be at lower altitudes. Despite its established dependability and significant cargo capacity, the C-54 was not suitable for flights across the Hump due to its poor high-altitude performance. Additionally, the C-54 had a much better safety record than the C-87. However, this may have been mostly because the Douglas transport was flown at lower altitudes than the Liberator Express. However, the C-54s started replacing C-46s rather than C-87. Just as the transfer of the XEX Bomber Command transports to ATC significantly expanded the size of the India-China Division, Tunner assumed command in India. Naturally, the volume of merchandise transported increased as a result of the combination of a larger force and shorter, lower-altitude routes from India to China. The success of the Hump airlift in its last year has been overly attributed to Tunner, but he did introduce innovative maintenance and cargo handling practices that increased productivity. One of his first moves was to implement what he called production line maintenance, a system in which aircraft were positioned on a line that resembled an assembly line and moved when different maintenance tasks were finished. In the past, one aircraft at a time, a crew of personnel would perform all necessary maintenance tasks. As individual mechanics focused on particular jobs, Tunner's system permitted greater specialization. He used comparable methods for loading, handling, and processing freight as well. Tunner was also allowed to implement safety measures to try to reduce the accident rate because of the airlift force's expansion and the waning military urgency. The Allied victories in Europe and other parts of the Pacific Theater were also advantageous to Tunner. By the time he assumed command of the India-China Division, the air battle in Europe had been won, and Allied forces were moving forward from the beachhead in Normandy. There were more 4-engine pilots, aerial engineers, radio operators, and navigators available for transport duty as the need for replacement pilots in heavy bomber groups decreased. The staffs of the hundreds of primary flight schools were released for military service as a result of the decrease in primary flight training brought about by the combat group's decreased need for skilled air crews. As the war in China came to an end, the Army Air Forces made decisions that also helped Tunner and the India-China Division. The enormous troop carrier and combat cargo organization, created to support combat operations in the CBI, was made available for regular transport operations by the time Burma was freed in the spring of 1945. Another decision that significantly expanded ATC capabilities was made by the CBI's top American air officer, Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer. He and his staff concluded that the four-engine B-24 Liberators of the 7th and 308th Bombardment Groups would be more effective in transport missions than in tactical operations, and that the fuel expense of operating heavy bombers from bases in China was prohibitive. Stratemeyer directed in May that the 3rd and 4th Combat Cargo Groups, the 433rd Troop Carrier Group, and the 2 bombardment groups be placed under the operational command of the ATC's India-China Division. Efficiency was not the only factor in the relocation. The deployment of more aircraft and crews would improve ATC capabilities, as the ATC effort had fallen more than 4,000 tons short of its April quota. The combat personnel viewed their new assignment as demeaning and were resentful of the relocation. The bomber and troop carrier crews, all veterans of months and often years of Hump operations, were even more resentful that they were required to go through a week of training under the watchful eye of ATC staff. Ironically, compared to ATC, the combat cargo and troop carrier squadrons had been transporting significantly more goods across the Hump. ATC moved twice as much tonnage in March 1945 as troop carriers and combat cargo transport combined. Tonnage Tunner was now in charge of the previous combat air crews, and the commander of the India-China Division demanded that the combat crews receive the same training as recently assigned crews from the United States. The bomber and troop carrier combat cargo crews contributed significantly to the airlift to China through the end of the war, despite their animosity and subsequent low morale. Their participation was the only reason the India-China Division was able to surpass 5,000 tons each month. The need for the airlift of supplies to China decreased as the war came to a conclusion. However, the airlift persisted until November, as Allied forces in China advanced into previously Japanese-occupied area. Sam McGowan is a pilot himself. He lives close to Houston, Texas,